Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
With an international pandemic changing many of our lives, the idea of children returning to school in the next few weeks has generated a number of questions. On today's show, we're going to look at how parents, students, and educators can ensure a responsible return to school, both in person and through remote learning. So how effective is remote learning, and what changes should schools be implementing to improve student success? Well, we're going to answer these questions and more. Lance Jackson, my co-host and an educator of more than 35 years, is the senior resident historian at TrueChat, and we'll introduce our guests.
Good day, folks. Our first guest, Cindy Cisneros, is the Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, D.C., and she's been working to improve education practically her entire life. Cindy is a recurring guest on The State of Us and longtime friend of the show. Thanks for joining us again, Cindy.
Thanks so much. Pleased to be here.
And we also get to speak with Dr. Laura Jana, a pediatrician, educator, health communicator, and award-winning author. Dr. Laura, thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Oh, really happy to join in on such an important conversation.
So, Cindy, students around the country are preparing to head back to school right now. It's that time of year. Some are looking at in-person and some possibly going back remotely. As parents and students alike are considering heading back, both of them have concerns about returning in person, and some are worried about what it'll mean if they have to keep going remotely. So what questions should parents and students be asking? What resources should they reference?
Both parents and students should have concerns. We're in the midst of a pandemic. There is no vaccine yet, and this situation has created quite a crisis and a level of devastation across the country, especially in education. So the types of questions they should be asked really have to do and focus on, first and foremost, the health and safety of the environment at the school for the children. What is the plan for ensuring protocols to ensure safety of kids? Will masks, needed to be, worn by students? Will there be temperature checks? Second, what's the plan for the actual academic learning and, the adaptations, given this change, in schools across the country? Another question, what are the responsibilities for the parents, at home when kids come back, and for students inside school and outside the classroom? Where if parents and students have questions, can they get, more answers and more information? I'm sure they'd want to know what happens if more cases persist, or if there are cases that are identified in the school, what is going to be the school's response? And if parents feel uncomfortable, and many will, and they want to choose to keep their kids at home instead, what's the learning adjustment and learning strategies that'll be put in place to support parents and families? Will there be on-site medical testing? And then very, very importantly, how is the technology component going to be addressed? If schools adapt a hybrid model where students are coming in part-time and then part-time being expected to do remote learning, do they have the technology in place? What if they don't? Do they have access to the internet? What if they don't? What are the investments and types of equipment and infrastructure and resources that'll be provided to support both students and parents? So those are just some of the questions, again, focused primarily on health and safety, and then how to adjust for the new learning environment, and if conditions continue to change, what's next?
What do you think are the biggest keys to returning to academic learning, both in the remote learning environment and the in-person learning?
I do think the emphasis really has to be on an understanding also of what's happening locally in the community. Lots of decisions are being made at the national level, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. There's actually a lot of confusion for parents, students, and educators. And so there is a lot of concern, and especially to consider the health and safety of educators as well. All the personnel in schools, all those staff, what is going to be done to, protect them from a health point of view. And educators in particular, which generally tend to be an older population, have more health risks associated. So there's definitely a lot of concern about that. So a real focus on how is the learning environment going to be structured? How are teachers and students going to be expected to interact? Is it going to be completely in person? Will it be completely online or a combination? If it's a combination, are educators going to get additional training, in order to deliver online learning, because it is very, very different than being in person?
A lot of what people are sensing and the frustration that people have is the kind of disjointed approach. And I think one of the things that Lance and I have discussed that the pandemic has highlighted is that we do have states and then local districts that make a lot of their own decisions in this regard. Is this the sort of thing from CED's perspective that there needs to be more federal guidance on, or do they feel that it's best left up to these local municipalities to decide what's best for their areas?
CED's perspective is definitely relying on the science and the data and really looking at the local context and the local conditions, because in order to even plan for learning, whether it's in person or remote, you really have to understand what is the course of the pandemic and the cases in the local community context, because that will help determine whether or not school is going to be reopened, all in person or being done all remotely. Some school districts have already decided to be preemptive about it. So in Los Angeles and San Diego, school districts in California, they've already announced that they're going online completely, like total online at the beginning of the new academic year, as well as Atlanta. And there are others that are doing a combination.
Right.
I mean, even the superintendent of Miami-Dade School District in Florida, they are doing a combination. But there is a real commitment to tracking and monitoring and understanding what is going on with the pandemic, so that they can prevent exposure to disease and reduce risk, at every conceivable level.
Speaking of remote learning, Dr. Laura, many people have some different thoughts about learning remotely and it being not as effective as in-person learning. And some of this has been particularly highlighted, especially this last spring. So what do we know about the effectiveness of different types of learning, primarily in-person versus remote learning? Is there data to support the claim that in-person learning is the best option?
Well, it's a really kind of gets to the heart of the issue, a really important question. And I think it even warrants backing up a step further and saying what we probably need to do is start thinking about what is learning and what are children learning? What is our hope for them to learn? And one of the things that makes the remote learning a little more challenging is it's one thing if we're just talking about the reading, writing, arithmetic type learning, right? The content substance side. But if we look at what schools are fundamentally meant to do and what they achieve with children in terms of child and adolescent development and well-being, it's not just academic, but it's social, emotional, and safety and nutrition and physical activity and all these other things that become much more difficult when you're in a remote environment. But getting then to the question more specifically of the remote versus the in-person, yes, what we do, the evidence has shown that even, the spring 2020 experience does now give us some evidence to show that the in-person is preferable, that there was, a lesser impact or negative impact from the remote side of things. The other thing to keep in mind about remote versus, the discussions around remote learning is that people tend to mix up online versus remote. I think probably from a very simple, practical way of looking at it, what we're talking about with remote learning, sometimes it really ends up being, we're trying to take what they were doing in school and have the children and thus the parents and all simulate it at home, sitting at a computer with the same time schedule and the same sort of strategy. And I think what this is going to take, it's becoming very clear, is that we need to rethink what the purposes of what we're trying to teach and what we want kids to learn, and becoming more flexible about how we do that so that it's not just a matter of simulating what they were doing, sitting however many hours in a classroom at home. And that's going to change that sort of remote learning experience. But yes, and the last thing I will say, I, as a pediatrician who sort of straddles both health and education, and I sort of look at the foundational development of the sort of skills needed for learning and education and future job success and all these sorts of things. If we even look to early childhood, but I've always made the case it applies across all ages. We know, for example, that preschoolers who are shown something educational in a video do not learn the information in that video, even if it's designed specifically for children, as well as if it was one session in person. But it starts to closely approximate if you do it in repetition, right? So multiple viewings. So the point is that it gives us an opportunity in a less than an ideal situation, right? Nobody wants a global pandemic. But even if we can't get quite to the level of in-person, there's huge opportunity with technology and online and remote learning if we take the opportunity to sort of be now more innovative about our approach, not just try to cram what was happening in the classrooms, traditional classrooms, onto an online setting.
We've been talking with Cindy Cisneros and Dr. Laura Jana about how to responsibly return to schools in the age of COVID-19. But a number of questions still remain. What can be done to improve remote learning and make lasting positive changes for students? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we've been talking about returning to school in the midst of a global pandemic with Cindy Cisneros and Dr. Laura Jana.
We are now going to discuss what can be done to improve remote learning and make lasting, positive changes for students.
Cindy, remote learning has become front and center for many parents, students, and educators. And we started talking about that kind of at the end of the last segment. We saw a number of challenges and disparities with various school districts across the country this past spring. Regardless of where people stand on whether or not they like remote learning or not, it's clearly going to be more prevalent this coming school year. So what do we have to do in order to universally improve it?
So it is definitely going to be the case. That is the way of the future. And planning is going to be an important component to make sure that it can be done successfully. One thing that, as I had mentioned, Miami-Dade School District and Los Angeles School Districts had both taken a very intentional approach in trying to identify the level of technology equipment and access for all of their kids in homes, and worked to provide what was needed. So there does have to be a commitment to identify the needs. There has to be a commitment to purchase the equipment and be able to deliver that internet access. So that really means that there's going to have to be a level of investment required greater than before, because we're in a pandemic, because of the crush on the economy at both the state and national level. So we're going to need an additional infusion of funding in order to pull this off for schools across the country. And training is also going to have to be provided. In some schools, they provided training to parents so that they understand the platforms in which the kids are going to be using. So they do have to be creative. They do have to be innovative. There has to be additional professional development for teachers so that they understand how to best provide online delivery, because it is indeed different. than in classroom. So there is going to be a heavy technology investment, heavy investment on, methodology in terms of how to best train in a remote setting.
Dr. Laura, I know that educators often believe we must choose between one method or another. And I go all the way back to a chalkboard and an eraser to last year doing video and Zoom sessions teaching my students. So I know we think that one, we have to choose between one or the other, but different students do learn differently. So, you kind of adapt in your classroom all the time for your students. So how can school districts and teachers better serve children in the age of COVID? What can we learn from what we've done in the past and adapt it to what we're dealing with now?
Well, I think what's particularly helpful is to take a step back and look at what we're dealing with COVID. Because on the one hand, it's a particular virus, it's a pandemic. But what it's really doing is accelerating and bringing to light sort of a fundamental need for change in the system. And you have hit the nail on the head with one of those things, which has become very clear, not even just in the education sector, but across all sectors. I spend a lot of time pointing out to people, here's the world we're living in and how do we raise children to succeed in it? And one of the core fundamental aspects is that we are shifting from a more one-size-fits-all mentality, and as you mentioned, an all or nothing, it has to be one way or it has to be another, to a much more customized and personalized approach. And again, this is across all sectors. It's manufacturing, it's healthcare, it's everything. But the challenge is that we have to customize and personalize at the exact same time that we have to think about operationalizing and scaling. All right. And so that is a pervasive challenge. COVID is bringing that to light because how one child learns is very different from another. And now we have to figure out how do we mix remote learning into that. And some people do much better with in-person than others. So I think it's very worthwhile to consider those aspects. So it's not just a COVID thing. But what teachers can do, I mentioned it earlier, but part of what's really coming to light, and I also owned a private school for almost 10 years and really had to focus on these things, is what people are particularly struggling with when I hear from educators and I speak to educators is how do we engage students? How do we help, their sort of the mental health and social emotional, both wellness and sort of competencies and those sorts of things that seem a little more intangible than can we assess did they get the right answer to a mathematical, problem. And so I think what teachers can do and what school districts can do is try to figure out how to, again, in the case of remote learning and technology, set it up so that you've got engaged students and that you've got, you pique their curiosity. A lot of the challenge with the remote learning is, a lot of kids aren't showing up, whether in a literal sense, they're not showing up or they're there, but becoming very smart, right? Kids who learn to play videos of themselves on loops so that they look like they're attending the session. And so that's where trying to get kids so that they have a place to come in contact and be part of a group and have some showing up time, but also some asynchronous learning that they can do on their own. It has to be engaging. It has to be, pique their curiosity. It has to be relatively simple to navigate and all. And doing those things, by the way, again, is not just specific to education. It's just hugely important in education. But the same holds true if you're going to hold a Zoom meeting for a business, right? I mean, for the workforce. So really key areas. And I think this is an opportunity for education to really focus on it because it certainly is known to enhance educational outcomes when we do.
Cindy, I know that as we've talked in the past about some of what CED focuses on, and when Lance and I talk about it, we do talk about, as Dr. Laura's highlighted, the need in some cases to rethink some of how we're approaching the system as a whole. And the pandemic is just providing another context in which to do that. But this is an excellent time, I'd imagine, right, to continue to look at the opportunity to do more workforce preparedness for students, especially as the workforce is changing and you have these kids that are graduating now, entering a very different world than they would have even just a year ago.
Absolutely. And, to Dr. Jana's point about, we do have this opportunity to be creative and innovative with the use of technology and help personalize that level of education. And that is going to be particularly important for the most disadvantaged kids in making sure our kids with special needs are also being considered as well, because adaptations will be needed to make sure that particular demographic and population is being addressed. And by preparing our kids with these additional skills and getting more familiar and fluent with technology, that will definitely help prepare them for the future of work, because for the very near future and even in the short term, this is our new world. This is the new world order, and being able to, be facile in this realm and utilizing technology will help give them the additional skill sets and experiences that they need, when they're able to take that step into the workplace, wherever it may be. So it will help prepare them for college and career and the workplace of the future. There's no question about that. And as long as they're provided with sufficient resources to do that, then there can be increased success.
As an educator, I couldn't agree with you more, but Dr. Laura, we've discussed a number of changes that could be implemented not only to improve education during this pandemic, but also improve education for the foreseeable future. For those non-educators, I know as an educator, we need their support. What should we be telling them so that they will support these changes? And why should they not only support the changes, but actively be a part of making them as well and being a part of the decision-making process?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because that's actually the question around which Cindy and I have had the pleasure to collaborate, and then I've gotten to work with CED amongst other organizations. But that's because what I have focused on is, again, that question of what is the 21st century presenting us with, and how do we raise children to succeed in that world? Not the one that I grew up in necessarily, but the one that my children are going to be growing up in and we want them to be successful in. And I've given a couple TED Talks on the subject, but my quick distillation of the concept is that we really need to, first of all, think about what the world is that we're living in. It's globally complex and rapidly changing, right? And so that demands a new set of skills. And I actually created a framework, a very simple one. I won't go into the details, but of what is the shift in skills? And I'll give you one example, which is when everyone's got, almost everyone has access to technology and to answers, right? Information, lists, things. All of a sudden, things like critical thinking and curiosity and asking good questions becomes all the more valuable, while just knowing the right answer becomes less valuable. Same thing in a rapidly changing world. And this is where COVID has really stretched us thin on this one. You have to be able to not only move quickly, but be adaptable. And you can see that society is not particularly comfortable with, well, you told us one thing yesterday and you're telling us another thing today, because people aren't quite grasping. The world changes very quickly, and technology has fueled exponential change in areas even before COVID hit. So with that in mind, what I see for the foreseeable future is if we focus on this set of skills, I called them key skills, as in it sounds like KEY, but QI, which is the complement to the IQ skills, the reading, writing, arithmetic-like skills. But there are those soft and non-cognitive other skills, right? And I always say communication, collaboration, teamwork, adaptability, engagement, curiosity, emotional intelligence. All these skills that we know are important are now becoming all the more important. We customize and personalize what we do. We focus on the whole child. Again, the IQ skills are still important. The World Economic Forum lists 16 skills. A third of them important for future success are those IQ skills. The rest are the ones that I called the key skills. And we, to Cindy's point, have to make sure that it's accessible, affordable, and that we really maintain an eye on equity and disparity, because otherwise that just stands to get worse if we don't address it as we innovate.
Cindy and Dr. Laura, we appreciate you both taking some time to speak with Justin and me.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was great to be back.
To learn more about the Committee for Economic Development, visit their website, ced.org. And to connect with Dr. Laura Jana, visit her website, drlaurajana.com. How can we use what we've learned today from Cindy and Dr. Laura in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our conversations? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we had the opportunity to speak with Cindy Cisneros, the Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington. And we also got to speak with Dr. Laura Jana, who is a pediatrician, educator, health communicator, and award-winning author. So we had quite the conversation today, Lance. At least I think so. They had a good bit to say, and I think we hopefully provided some good information for people, some things to take into consideration about what's it going to look like to go back to school. The one thing we didn't get to cover that I think it's important you and I talk about, we did get to kind of talk with them about this in between the segments here before they left it up to you and I to finish things out, but is the educator component, right? Because this is I think it was Dr. Laura that explained it's really important to think about if it really doesn't matter what you're doing, if parents don't feel their kids will be safe, or if educators don't feel that they will be safe, you can put in place or say you're going to do whatever you want. But if they don't feel that those things are going to be the case, the rest of it's kind of immaterial.
Well, and to start with a positive comment before I get into to address that, I think that what we have here and what they did a great job of explaining earlier was that we have an opportunity to revamp the education system. That this pandemic has done a lot of horrible things and continues to do so. But it also now gives education a chance to step back and say, okay, what do we need to do so that we can prepare workers for the future? That things aren't the same, that students don't need the same education that they've been getting. And we need to change our approach so that we can be more effective. And as they both said off air, take human capital as the most important thing. And what can we do to better advance those? So that's the positive side. The negative side that we discussed is healthcare workers signed up to be healthcare workers. They knew that they might get in some kind of environment where they could be threatened. Now, you don't want them to be threatened, but the whole discussion, remember back in March of not having enough PPE and having enough ventilators and all those kinds of things. We were, clapping our hands together and banging pots and pans, thanking the healthcare workers for what they've done. Well, on some level, depends on, I guess, your opinion, we've now asked educators and support personnel to do the same thing. And that's not the job the career that they chose. They chose to educate young people or to feed them or to watch over them and take them to recess or work with them in a one-on-one situation. They didn't sign on to be in the middle of a healthcare crisis. And so I appreciate everybody worrying about the children, but you also then have to take into account all of the adults that are working with the children and what you're asking them to do. And are you providing them with the same level of protection and the same level of cleaning that you are with healthcare workers? And my concern, and I don't know how this is going to play out, but I know talking just anecdotally to many of my educator friends, there's a real concern about re-entering the classroom with this situation. And you and I are lucky in the sense that we live in a environment right now where it's not as bad as it is in Miami or Southern California, who I have family and friends who do live in Southern California, and a niece who's working in the education system, and so just some transparency there. But there's a real concern among educators. Well, what if I don't want to be in this environment? And what if enough parents don't want remote learning or online learning, because, that's a hybrid in some cases where the parents get to decide, which is a great factor. But what if I don't want to do this? Okay, what are my options? And if I choose not to go back in the classroom and I decide to go into a different job field or whatever, my concern is, how do we fill those classroom positions? And that's a conversation that I'm not hearing among anybody. And even the professional ladies that we talked to today didn't really have an answer to that. And they thought that was a great point. So that's a real concern. You can be whatever politician or education leader that you want and say, yes, we're going to have in-person learning and we're going to bring the teachers in and we're going to have the students in. Well, what if the teachers up and say, you know what? Or enough of them say, I'm not coming in. If that means I have to retire or I have to get fired or I have to switch professions, I'm going to do that. Where are you going to find all these unemployed teachers to step into the classroom across the country? That's my big takeaway right here with this whole thing that we didn't talk about. And that's a negative. My positive is that this is a great time for education to revamp and do a better job of training young people for the jobs that they're going to have in the 21st century.
They had talked about a lot of teachers are in the older demographic. And if you're talking about as much as 1/5 of all teachers walking off the job, and when I say that, I'm not like saying protesting, I mean, leaving, retiring, I don't even know how you would go about handling that. I think you'd probably get into the only way to handle it would be to look at, remote or online learning, because it'd be the only way that teachers could handle the capacity of students that would have to be managed. If you have something like that happen. And then it's almost like, well, if you're going to do that anyway, if you're going to be pushed in that situation, then why not just put in place what's necessary to keep the teachers around in the first place so that you don't get into that? Because, I think everybody's, we're concerned about the pandemic, whether or not you agree with the shutdown stuff and the mask mandates and that sort of stuff. I think this is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds in different ways. But the reality is, I think most Americans feel like we're going to get through this and someday we'll go back to, whatever quote unquote normal is. And someday we'll be able to go back to the classroom, if we want to do that. But in the meantime, we have to do a couple things. I think we have to accept, as Dr. Laura was pointing out, that, we know that the outcomes are not as good with remote learning right now. But a big part of the reason they're not as good is because you have a lot of people that view it as, well, we're just going to take what we did in the classroom. And you and I, Lance, have talked a lot about this off air, and we're just going to do it, remotely. And it's like, no, you can try that, but what we found is that doesn't work. That doesn't engage kids. And so the outcomes aren't good because kids are they're not able to focus and get involved with the content the same as they would when they're in person, because the way that you're teaching in person is for an in-person environment. So it has a lot to do with making sure that the educators have the resources necessary, the access to the training and the skill set to be able to adjust their classes to that online format. And I thought that was impactful too, to understand the difference between remote and online learning. Part of the problem is that I think people view them as interchangeable. And when you look at a lot of online classes that have success, they were built as an online class. They were not, we meet in person and then we just became online. They were, from the get-go, they were designed as a remote learning solution from the ground up, not we, transitioned it later. So I think all of that's important to keep in mind of, we don't have to accept that online and remote learning has worse outcomes. We can do things to improve it. At the same time, I think, Lance, you brought up in one of your questions that kids do learn differently. And for some kids, not being physically in person is just never going to work as well. And for other kids, being remote may work even better than being in person. So it's kind of that while this situation we're in is terrible, it provides us this opportunity to really think about how do we view how we're offering education to students, because we don't have to keep offering it the way that we've always done, which is there's no options. Because we could be dealing with this for quite a while into the foreseeable future here, the next, at least 6 to 12 months and possibly longer. So I think now's the time where you have to have those conversations and really decide, what are we going to do? Because if we just say we're just going to keep doing what we've been doing, the students are going to suffer, educators will suffer as well. And nobody wants that, regardless of where you are at on this.
Remote learning in and of itself is not bad. It's getting a bad rap right now because it wasn't done well. But it wasn't done well because, as Cindy pointed out, teachers weren't given training or the resources to do it well, along with the students and the parents. So there's some education that needs to take place and some items that need to be put in people's hands so that it can be done well. But it can be done well. There are classes, and I've taken them, where they were designed to be taken online or remotely, and they were very informative. And I'm more of a in-person person in the classroom. That's what I grew up with. But you're exactly right. We have to design those classes are different than they will be online. And they, in and of themselves, aren't bad. It's only bad when you try to take the in-classroom experience and say, okay, here's a Zoom meeting or some kind of, in-person meeting that we're going to have on the computer. And that doesn't work. That I agree with you wholeheartedly. And with our guest today, that doesn't work, but it can work. And I second what you said there. So a lot of things to think about. And the thing is, we don't have much time. This is happening as we speak. Schools have begun to go back into session, and most of them will be in session by Labor Day or shortly thereafter.
Real important, I think, that people be engaged with their local school district right now, because part of, like we talked about, if educators and parents are not comfortable, and from, a higher education level and students are not comfortable, that's going to create the problem. So they need to be making sure they're providing feedback in real time to their districts, so that the districts can at least take that. They have the opportunity to take that into account. I guess you can't say that they will for sure or not, but at least if it's being put out there, they're doing their part to make sure that we, as the people in the community, are communicating to the district. These are the things that we feel like need to be done to make sure that we feel safe returning to the in-person stuff or continuing the remote learning stuff. Because I think it's in both cases, right? If people don't embrace it, it won't go well no matter what. And that's in-person or remote. And I think that's part of so many people have never done this before. And so it's not going to be great out of the gate. And everybody has to take into account, we have to embrace and be willing to try in order to make it successful. And we can't just be lazy and hope to duplicate what we do in person, because it's not an in-person setting.
In an economic sense, the parents and the students are the customer.
Right.
And if you don't like what you're being given, you need to voice that concern to the owners.
I think it's an apt thing to hopefully leave people with and contemplate some, because like you said, there's not a lot of time. So, and that's part of why we had this conversation today. School's coming up, and True Chat's all about trying to bring attention to those issues that maybe are being discussed, but maybe not necessarily in the way that they need to be. And I think we provided, hopefully, a good conversation for people to think about and take into consideration today. So what are we trying to do here, Lance? The network of shows at True Chat. What's our goal as a network?
Our mission with every show is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we need you to get the word out. It's not enough for just us to have these respectful conversations, but we need people to listen, and you need to share that with folks. And if they need to know where to find us, you can tell them. They can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found, as well on the weekends as a syndicated radio show.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to Bradley Bush, our producer, for putting all this together. And of course, to our guests, Dr. Laura Jana and the Cindy Cisneros. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.